Hello my dears, welcome back to another video. So today's video is kind of lastminute.com. I want to talk about the complete and utter chaos that's currently happening in the UK because of the whole royal family, Ngozi Fulani. The whole situation is just an absolute mess. So long story short, Lady Susan Hussey, who was a lady in waiting for the Queen, she served her for 60 years. She's also Prince William's godmother. She went to a charity event, and at that charity event, she met Ngozi Fulani. Ngozi Fulani is a very eccentric character because Ngozi Fulani doesn't dress like your regular standard Westerner British person. Lady Susan took an interest in her and so went up to her and asked her, "Oh, where are you from?" But Ngozi Fulani took offense to this, not really answering her question, saying things like, "Oh, I'm from Sister Space," which is her charity organization, which is also an interesting thing that we'll talk about a bit later on in the video. So the Lady Susan was like, "No, where are you from? Where do you come from?" Meaning, obviously, what is your ethnic background? What is your heritage? Because you're clearly dressed like you arrived in England yesterday. Ngozi Fulani decided to still be very evasive, not really answering the question. So I think what happened is that Lady Susan kept repeatedly asking the question because she thought that Ngozi was misunderstanding her. Because there's even a part within the transcript which Ngozi Fulani supplied herself. We don't know if this is exactly what was said. It hasn't been verified. So at the moment, the only version of events that we have to go off of is Ngozi's. So we only have one side of the story at this current moment in time, but that's the story that everyone's currently running with. Within the transcript, it shows that Lady Susan then says to her, "I spent time in France. Where are you from?" Which implies to me that Lady Susan thought that Ngozi was misunderstanding her, which is why she then tried to share information about her background so that Ngozi would understand what she's asking her and hoping that maybe that would make her feel more comfortable to say what her heritage was. So I think that's why she was so persistent with the question, because I think she thought that Ngozi was genuinely just misunderstanding her. Now, do I think that Lady Susan could have handled the situation a little bit better? Personally, I think that Lady Susan should have walked away from Ngozi a lot sooner than she did. I think the moment Ngozi started giving very strange responses, she should have just realized, what, it's not even worth it. Let me just leave. But Lady Susan is 83 years old. Now, I don't know if you've had a conversation with an elderly woman in recent times, but I have. There was an old lady, bless her, came to knock at my door, wanted to give me a letter for one of my neighbors. And when I tell you I was stuck in that conversation for over 30 minutes, despite politely trying to exit it several times, I ended up burning my food as well, which was very upsetting. To be fair, if I had said to her, "I'm cooking at the moment," she probably would have let me go, but I didn't. So technically it's my own fault that I burnt the food, because I don't know why I didn't think to just tell her that. But regardless, my point is there are some elderly people who just don't get social cues. So Lady Susan, I think, genuinely might not have understood that Ngozi was trying to be evasive. I think she just thought, we're having a misunderstanding, but I'm determined to help you understand me. But anyways, fast forward to now, and Ngozi Fulani is going on a press tour and going to speak to several different publications about how she feels as though the whole interaction with Lady Susan was a form of abuse. She feels as though she was violated and abused by the interaction.
Abuse doesn't have to be physical. But if you move my hair without permission, to me, that's abuse. When you verbally attack, because that to me is what it is, you are determined that the answer that I gave you is not one you want to hear. You do not recognize me as British. And until I acknowledge that I am not, you are not going to stop.
Because there is nothing more violent and aggressive than asking someone what their heritage is. It's just the most disgusting form of bigotry that you could possibly do to someone. Absolutely appalling. Ngozi also says that Lady Susan moved her hair to see her name badge. Now, this is kind of weird, I'll be honest. Don't touch people's hair. Don't touch people you don't know like that in general. It is kind of strange. Don't do that. So I will say, Lady Susan, if it is true, because we don't know if that's actually true or if that even happened, but if it is true, Lady Susan, come on now. Let's not touch strangers. You know what I'm saying? But Ngozi is saying that the act of Lady Susan moving her hair to see her name badge is a form of abuse. And it's crazy to me because this woman works for a shelter that helps domestic violence survivors. Speaking of her charity is for domestic violence survivors, right? But it only caters to Black ones. So like, if you turn up to the door battered and bruised and you're not black, you're not African and you're not Caribbean, sorry innit? Which is interesting because how is that legal and how is that not racist? As someone who looks like me and has a name like mine, I've been asked several times where I'm originally from, where my family's from, what my heritage is. You guys have seen it on this channel. I get asked all the time on my channel where I'm from. Are you South African? Are you Japanese? Are you Zimbabwean? Are you whatever? I get asked all the time where I'm from, and I don't find it offensive. First of all, 9 times out of 10, the person who's going to ask you where are you from looks like you. The vast majority of the people who are curious about my heritage look like me. Right? And I don't find it racist or offensive when they're asking me that question. So why should I suddenly find it racist and offensive if a white person asks me the exact same question? I personally think that asking someone where they're from or asking them what their heritage is actually quite flattering because it shows that you have an interest in them. You want to know, where their roots are from, or you want to know what their ethnicity is because you're just curious to know. We're human beings. We're curious about each other. It's kind of like a thing that we do. We ask each other questions about each other. If I hear someone with an accent, regardless of what their skin color is, I'm going to ask them, hey, where are you from? Because if it doesn't sound like my accent or it doesn't sound like the accent of the people around me, I'm going to be curious. Where are you from? And so if you see someone who's dressed in a way that doesn't look like standard British clothing, you're going to ask them, where are you from? Because they don't look like what you're used to, so you're curious. There is nothing racist about what Lady Susan asked. Granted, she was a bit pushy, she was a bit persistent. I can understand why some people who are born in this country might find it offensive when they're asked the question, where are you from? Because they take it as purely because of the color of my skin, you assume that I must have not been born here. Personally, I don't find it offensive because I wasn't born here, so you're not wrong when you say, where did you come from? I did actually come from somewhere else. I do think that it's probably better or just safer to completely just avoid the question altogether if you don't know the person, because we've learned that some people are crazy. Or if you are going to ask, word it differently. Rather than saying where are you from or where'd you come from, just say, what's your ethnic heritage? I understand though that the person asking the question is just simply asking because clearly if you're that melanated, your family must have come from somewhere else, right? Because it doesn't make sense for you to have that much melanin in a cold, cloudy, rainy country. Do you know what I mean? So maybe it wasn't you, but maybe your parents, maybe your grandparents, someone came from somewhere else before you guys ended up here. And there's nothing wrong with being curious about where that place was, especially because Britain is not like the States. Black people in Britain are either first generation, second generation, or third generation. But to ask that question to someone in Britain, it's not offensive because most of us will either be African or Caribbean or something. We would have come from somewhere else. Maybe even if it's not us directly, it might be our parents or our grandparents, but most of us still have roots somewhere else. And I feel like if you're proud of your heritage and you're proud of where you come from or you're proud of where your family comes from, that shouldn't be offensive. Why do you care whether or not someone thinks that you might not be a full, true blood Englishman? You're not. So why is it offensive? Why is the truth offensive? I said on my Twitter, a true racist would not ask you where are you from. Racist people don't typically care to ask you where you're from. They usually just will be like, you're from Nigeria or something, aren't you? Go back to your own country. Racists typically avoid you. And they don't typically take an interest in your heritage. So how do you think the situation was handled? Do you think the situation was brushed off to the side as a misunderstanding and a inconvenience type of situation and that people just simply addressed it and moved on? If you thought that, then you have too much faith in humanity. Absolutely not. This has been all over the news. It's been the biggest story on the BBC. All of the news outlets and stuff are talking about it as if there aren't bigger problems to be concerned about, such as the fact that poverty in the UK is increasing right now and there are plenty of people having to rely on food banks for survival. Those kind of stories aren't important because some black woman somewhere was asked where she's from, and that has to be the top story. Of course it does. Absolutely. Not only that, but Lady Susan Hussey was then forced to resign from a position that she's held for 60 years. And Prince William released a statement addressing the situation, and this is what he said. I was really disappointed to hear about the guest's appearance at Buckingham Palace last night. Obviously, I wasn't there, but racism has no place in our society. The comments were unacceptable, and it is right that that individual has stepped aside with immediate effect. Now, bear in mind that Lady Susan is Prince William's godmother, and the fact that he can't even address her by her name, he just calls her that individual, is just beyond disrespectful to me, in my personal opinion. And the fact that he said that those statements were super unacceptable and I'm happy that the person has resigned, I think is just super telling of the kind of situation that we're in at the moment, where the royal family has been successfully bullied. It's ever since Meghan Markle came into their lives, they cannot catch a break. And now they are so afraid of having any more accusations of racism that they are just going to go on the virtue signaling train as soon as they can to let people know, look, guys, I swear to God, we're not racist. I know Meghan said what she said, but look, I'm firing my godmother. She's been in my life since I was born. She served my mum for 60 years, but I will throw her under the bus to prove to you that we are not a racist family, okay? Like, guys. I honestly find William's response to be so disappointing. Like, William, grow a backbone. Like, you've known this woman for a long time. If she was actually racist, I'm pretty sure we would have heard about her being racist by now, considering she's been serving the Queen for 60 years. And this isn't something that has come out within the royal family. And it's not as if the royal family aren't around black people. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, if this woman was truly a racist, we would have heard about this before. Why is it after 60 years of service, all of a sudden now she's a raging racist? I would have had a lot more respect for William if he'd come forward and said, listen, Lady Susan is my godmother. In all the time that I've known her, she's always been kind to the people around her, and I'm sure that she didn't mean to offend. However, if there was a misunderstanding and she did end up causing offense, I'm very sorry for that, and she's also very apologetic. We will learn from this experience and aim to do better, or something along those lines. That would have been a much more respectful statement, because you at least are standing up for her rather than just throwing her under the bus, but you're also acknowledging the situation and acknowledging the fact that it has offended someone and that you will improve moving forward. And I also think the British media need to stop parading these race baiters, the Ngozi Fulanis, the Dr. Shollas. Why are they parading these types of characters on television all the time? And it's just like, all you're doing is increasing racial tensions in Britain, you're increasing divides, and we're going to become more and more like America. No offense, America. Like, you guys are cool and everything, but your racial tensions are not something that I personally would like to have here. Because here's the thing, right? Americans have always been obsessed with race. The Brits have always been obsessed with class, right? We've always been typically a very classist society. It's not necessarily better. It's still pretty crap that we are, but that's kind of how it's always been. But recently, since social media, and also Meghan Markle hasn't helped because she brought all of her American racial politics and then pissed off with Harry to the States. But like recently, because of all these different things that have happened, Britain is becoming more and more racially divided. And I really don't like it, because I see America and I see what this kind of rhetoric and these kind of divisions have caused in America when it comes to things like the riots and the looting and the protests. It's not a positive direction to go in. We know what it looks like when you go in that direction, because America is an example of that. And we don't have all of that stuff happening in the UK yet. But if we keep allowing these race baiters to continue to divide people in Britain, and we keep giving them all this airtime and rewarding them for their crappy behaviour, this could be what our future looks like. And I don't really like it, which is why I think it's important to speak out against it. And I'm quite happy that we've seen quite a lot of prominent black people also calling this out, because the last thing we need is for people to think that we all condone this stuff and that we all agree with this stuff, when there's most black people, if they were in that situation, would not have handled it the way Ngozi chose to handle it. Now, there has been a lot of speculation about why Ngozi has chosen to do this. You know, some people think that she's a Meghan Markle plant who was deliberately injected into this situation to provide more examples so that Meghan's accusations of racism can be stronger and perceived as more valid in the eyes of the public. The reason why people have come to this conclusion is because Ngozi Fulani released some very interesting tweets. So she basically released a tweet saying that she believed that Meghan Markle was the victim of domestic violence at the hands of her in-laws. Now, Meghan Markle herself has never said that, and it's quite odd. This is something that Ngozi Fulani just decided. She just came to the conclusion to. I don't know where she got that from. I don't know where she took that from, but that is a statement that she released. There are also some people who think that maybe she's doing this for her charity, which I think is quite credible. I personally do think that this whole thing has been a publicity stunt. I think this could be a case of her trying to bring attention to her charity, maybe to get more funding for it or something, because she keeps talking about abuse and she keeps talking about violence, and her charity is about helping Black women who are victims of domestic violence and abuse. So it kind of makes sense. And she's going on all of these press tours, basically just going from show to show to show, giving interviews to pretty much everyone who will have her. So it does make sense that this could be potentially a publicity stunt to get more funding for her charity, which is what I think is probably the most likely situation that's happening here. I think that she wanted all of this to come out. She claims in an interview that she didn't want people to know that it was Lady Susan.
We just want to bring it back to the 16 days of activism. This is about violence against women and girls. And although I didn't experience physical violence, what I feel I experienced was a form of abuse.
Well, there's been a swift reaction from the palace once they realised what had happened. Lady Hussey has stepped down as well. Is that something that you welcome?
I think how the palace handles that situation is between the palace and the person. Now, I have to make clear, it wasn't my intention that her name should be out there. I just used initials because I personally, she's an elder, and we respect the elders in our community, and I do not want anything to happen to her in terms of people hounding her. And what will that solve? Nothing. So why can't we get something positive out of this?
If you look at her transcript, she said Lady SH. Now, we don't have a whole bunch of people walking around with the title of Lady, let alone people with the title of Lady whose initials are SH. This whole idea that she didn't want people to know who it was is complete and utter bollocks. Like, she absolutely wanted people to know who she was. Otherwise, she would have either just not put the name, she would have put person or someone or whatever. But if you're putting Lady SH, how are people not going to know who you're talking about? You want people to know who you're talking about. Like, it's just, the whole thing is just absolute, she's lying. Like, she wanted people to know who she was talking about because she wanted the publicity. And if you didn't want this whole thing to be a spectacle, you wouldn't be giving interviews to every single person who calls your phone. So I just don't buy that whatsoever. I think she's lying when she says that. Now, as much as I find what Ngozi has done to be completely shameful and just completely ridiculous, there's a part of me that feels sorry for her. Now, hear me out. I've seen characters like Ngozi before. So these types of characters usually tend to be either Caribbean or Black American. So there are some people who are Caribbean or who are Black American who, because they were brought over from Africa in the slave trade and their ties to Africa were severed and completely broken, they develop a bit of an identity crisis. And they have this like really deep, intense longing to know where they came from. What they'll do is they'll start changing the way they dress. They'll start wearing like dashikis or traditional African attire, and they'll start learning about African history. You'll find in their homes that they have loads of African ornaments and all this kind of stuff everywhere. They'll do those DNA ancestry tests so they can find out exactly where they're from. And in some cases, they'll even go as far as to change their name because they feel as though that their name is associated with their slave master, and so they don't want anything to do with it, so they'll completely change their name to something that's more closer to the African more closer to their lost African heritage, etc. So the reason why I think that Ngozi is one of these types of characters is because she fits all of the typical behaviors that people like this exhibit. So the first example is that her real name is not Ngozi Fulani. Her legal name is Marlene Headley, but she changed it to Ngozi Fulani. Ngozi is a Nigerian name, and Fulani is the name of a tribe. So she just decided to put those two together and decided, this is my new name. Not only that, but she also went to university to study African studies. And she also complained apparently on the course because the person teaching her the African studies was a white person, which I find really odd because it's like, Ngozi, you were born in England. You were born and raised in England. Your family are from Barbados. You yourself likely, despite the fact that you're Black, don't know anything about African cultures or African heritages, which is why you're taking the course, right? So why is it so hard to believe that if a Black person might not know a lot about African heritage or African culture, that a white person could? Because there are white people who live in Africa and there are white people who take an interest in it and even study African culture. So why can't they know more than you about it? Anyways, moving on. So she changed her name to an African name. She studied African studies. She now dresses like an African caricature. The way Ngozi dresses is like she's cosplaying as a stereotypical African, because no actual African dresses like this. There is no African culture where people actively dress like this. Ngozi Fulani is what I imagine a racist would have put together if they had to make a stereotypical image of what they think an African dress is like. And also, considering Ngozi was born in Britain and her family are from Barbados, is this not cultural appropriation? I thought cultural appropriation was unacceptable. So what is this? But another reason as well why I think that Ngozi is one of these people who suffers with this identity crisis is because the way she answered the question to Lady Susan, when she eventually answered the question, was just very, very weird. So basically, when Ngozi said that her parents had come to the UK in the 50s, Lady Susan put together that, oh, you must be Caribbean, because that's like the Windrush and all that kind of stuff. That's when the Caribbeans came to Britain. So when she said that, that's when she was like, oh, okay, so you must be Caribbean. And so Ngozi corrects her and says, no, lady, I'm of African heritage, Caribbean descent, and British nationality. I've met Caribbeans, right? I've met sane ones. I've met sane Caribbeans. When you ask them, oh, what's your ethnic background, or what's your heritage, or where your family originally from, they will tell you, oh, Jamaica. Oh, cool. Barbados. That's how they talk. They don't go, I am of African heritage, Caribbean descent, and British nationality. So your descent of Caribbean and African heritage and but it's just such a bizarre way to answer the question. If your family came from Jamaica and someone asked you where are you from, or where your family from, you would say Jamaica. You wouldn't say Africa. Do you know, like, you wouldn't include Africa in there. No one normally talks like that, which is why I think that Ngozi Fulani has an identity crisis. And maybe the reason why Lady Susan's question triggered her so much is because the honest answer is she doesn't know. She doesn't know who she is. She doesn't know where she comes from. And so maybe Lady Susan triggered her by asking her that question, because Lady Susan thought that she was talking to someone who was mentally stable, but quite evidently was not. I saw a video of this white British woman, and she was saying how she just feels, quite frankly, frustrated and exhausted with the direction that things are headed in at the moment when it comes to the racial dynamics in Britain, because she feels as though as white people they just can't get it right. Because if you take an interest in someone's heritage, now you can be deemed a racist and you can be sacked from your job. Every little thing that you can do, now that's a microaggression. It's as if everything that you do is scrutinized, and everything that you say and do can be taken in the wrong way by some people and can make you deemed as a racist, even though you know in your heart that you're not, and you didn't have any negative intent behind those things. You were just curious, or you were just trying to be friendly. And I understand her frustration, because this is the kind of stuff that I'm talking about when I say I don't like the direction that Britain is headed in regards to racial discussions and in regards to racial dynamics, because we are becoming a lot more divided when it comes to the topic of race. I think it's very important for us as Black Brits to call out this kind of nonsense, because we are the only ones who can really call it out without being called racist, white supremacists, although people will still do that anyway. Knowing the internet, nothing makes sense. Somehow you can be black and the white supremacist. Okay. Regardless, I think it's important for us to call this stuff out, because from my perspective, I don't want Britain to become very racially divided. I don't think that would benefit us as a country. I don't think that would benefit us as a nation. I think we are much better when we're integrated. We're much better when we're not walking on eggshells around each other, when we're able to just have conversations with each other and make jokes with each other and make fun of each other even. I think that is when you have the healthiest country, when people are comfortable with each other. Because the problem is, when you increase racial tensions, what you end up doing is making people so uncomfortable around each other that they just completely avoid each other. So then you'll end up with people voluntarily segregating themselves from one another. Because if I know that I could potentially offend person A and it could result in me losing my job, I'm just going to completely avoid person A. But that's not a positive thing, because now you've got people who are segregated. And when you have segregated people within a society, people will inevitably start to become tribal. And tribalism, I don't know if you've picked up a history book, doesn't typically end very well. So I do think it's important to call out these kind of race baiters, these people who like to incite racial tensions and divide us on our race, because we have more in common with each other than we have differences, right? Our skin colors are different, yes, but at the end of the day, we're all British. We're all living in this country together. We're all being fucked over by our government, all right? And I just don't really like it when people try and cause divisions, when right now, if more than anything, we actually need to be working together. That was so cheese. But seriously though, I think that this kind of stuff is not healthy for a society. It's not healthy for us to encourage this stuff. And I wish our mainstream media would seriously stop giving these types of people airtime, because they're not helping the country, they're dividing us, and we can't allow that kind of stuff to happen. So I do really think that it's important for us to push back on this, because I don't want Britain to become super racially divided. I can tell you that Britain is leaps and bounds ahead of many European countries when it comes to being tolerant and inclusive of other races. When you travel around Europe, you realize how Britain is not really that racist. Does that mean Britain is perfect? Absolutely not. There are still some areas where we could improve on when it comes to racism. But we have made so many strides and so many progressions. We're not perfect, of course we're not, but we have made so much progression. And I don't think that any of that really gets acknowledged. But that is the end of this video. If you liked it, then like and subscribe. I really hope you're having a good weekend. Thank you very much for giving me your time today. And I will see you in my next video.